It said,
Hey, folks, welcome. I'm so delighted to have this conversation here with Eric Liu, who is he and his wife created this beautiful organization called Citizen University. He's had a long history of public service, including writing some of my favorite books that are heavily underlined, like Become America, and is one of the few people who I hold as being like a tender of the nation's soul, and really kind of gets what this place is supposed to be about, and has devoted his life to making it so. So, with that, welcome, Eric.
Brandon, thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. So, I know your time is precious, and you are have your thumb on a number of different scales. So, we will get right into the questions here. So, what is your current theory of change? How do we get from where we're at right now? Let's call it 6th of February, 2025, to get to a functioning democracy and civil society?
I mean, my theory of change and the theory of change of everything we do at Citizen University is that, um, well, two things. Number one, that as much as we worry about structural reform and policies when we talk about democracy, that actually culture precedes structure. And we've got to pay attention first to the norms, the values, the habits, the mindsets, the heart sets, the rituals that add up to how we live together, that add up to culture, civic culture. And that is upstream of elections, policy reforms, and the rest. And when you have a culture that is sick, selfish, atomized, nihilistic, without memory or sense of history, um, every man for himself, then your room for any kind of change on the structure policy side is very cramped. And conversely, if you have a culture that is mutualistic and oriented toward, service and contribution and recognizing that our fates are entwined and really recognizing that we're part of a larger ecosystem, then that opens up other possibilities, right? And so, first of all, our emphasis is on civic culture. Now, what does that mean? That can be very conceptual and abstract. So then the second part of what I would say in theory of action is that we believe that, again, we're talking at a time where everybody's attention is locked onto DC and what this new administration is trying to do. And we can talk a bit about that and why some vigilance is certainly required. But fundamentally, I believe that while presidents can break things in a hurry, only we in community can actually repair and build things durably. And so the second part of our theory of action is that any kind of democratic renewal or any kind of realizing of the promise of democracy has to begin in a local, relational, place based way that is rooted in people having an opportunity to deal with each other and see each other not as avatars, not as caricatures, but as complex people, human beings with whom they must live and with whom it is actually possible to do things, build things, and fix things. And that may seem very elementary, but it's actually contrary to most of what people think of when they talk about politics and democracy right now. Our ideas of democracy are super mediated, super nationalized, and focused on DC. And so, yeah, culture before structure, and place and people
Hmm.
prior to mediated forms of participation.
Thank you for that. And I've got a follow up question, but I also just want to share with folks this beautiful manual that Eric worked on with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and many other impressive scholars and change agents, that explores some of the broader theory and actually how you get it done and what works. The part that I'm most curious about right now, Eric, is like, because you had talked about the atomization, the selfishness. Like, how do we actually get the heart to open to include folks who are don't look like us, love us, like because that to me feels like kind of 1.1, like how do we get that in terms of that open so that we can actually have the culture that supports democratic society.
Well, I think, first of all, I love that you called that a manual, Habits of Heart and Mind. The title of that, some of your listeners and viewers will recognize, is a nod to Alexis de Tocqueville when he came to the young United States in the 1830s and tried to figure out what made this democracy in America tick. And he talked about actually how it was this deep-seated, ubiquitous habit of association, joining, forming groups, forming clubs, joining clubs. And they didn't even have to be political. They were not necessarily civic. They could be tradesmen's groups or arts groups or debate groups or book groups or local commerce groups, whatever it was. But the habit of joining and associating is foundational to democracy, foundational to being able to govern ourselves. And so I think my answer to your question begins with remembering how to join. When people are like, so much is on fire in our democracy, what do I do? My answer is always join a club.
Hmm.
Join a club. Like, don't overthink this. Go join a club. It can be on anything, but just getting back in the habit of regularly being with a group of people, most of whom you may not know, all of whom will have different worldviews or whatever. Or even if the group is ideologically aligned, you'll still be super diverse and different in other ways.
Hmm.
And then in that setting, learning how to come to common agendas, common goals, common strategies across uncommon perspectives is the muscle that is completely atrophied in our lives. And so I think that is really where it begins. It is if you're the catalytic type like you are, Brandon. We met because you participated in a program we have at Citizen University, the Civic Saturday Fellowship, where we are training civic catalysts like you all over the United States to lead gatherings and to form the clubs that invite other people in. And Civic Saturday is this ritual that is like a civic equivalent to a faith gathering. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be anything. So either join a club, or if you're feeling enterprising, start a club, and be the one to actually invite people and invite people to invite people, so that it's
Hmm.
not just, those you already know into the space. That again, it seems so elementary. And if our parents and grandparents were here, they'd be like, really? You have to be taught to do that? You have to remind each other to do that? And the answer is yes,
Yeah,
because
yeah, we do.
unfortunately we've lost those habits.
So I couldn't agree more, because I mean, to me, that's essentially practicing what democracy is. It's like you've got a shared purpose of some sort, whether it's to be a great bowling team or to advance your career, but there's like a shared thing that y'all have in common, and then being in community together and figuring out how do we get most of the people's needs met most of the time. That's democratic society. That's culture. You know. So I love that because that's something very practical and actionable that people can do. Now, for folks who are like, okay, that sounds great when everything's working as it should be. Now that we're like really starting to drift towards, chaos and accuracy, like I got a feeling a lot of folks are like, all right, have there been any examples of nations that have like come back from the brink and come back into like healthy functioning society? And if so, like, what do we do now, given like this moment in time? Is it still join a club, or is there something else that we should be paying attention to?
Well, to the second part of your question, I mean, what joining a club does, apart from some of the stuff we already talked about, is that it opens the door to becoming literate in power. So joining a club is not just like, yeah, have friends, we're going to have fun. That's great. That's true, and it's great. What also happens is that when you're in a group and you're having to decide things, you remember and you realize that the fundamental question of all civic life, all power in civic life is who decides. And so if within the scale of your group or the national organization that your group might be part of or whatever it is, you're having to come to realize like, oh, like we want to do it this way, but others are telling us we have to do it that way. Well, who decides? Well, that right there is practice in democracy, kind of both understanding, oh, it's not some abstract they out there who are deciding. Like this is a knowable thing. And in fact, I may be one of the people who gets to decide if I claim that role. And so, in addition to joining a club, becoming literate in power and understanding the contours of power, again, in a way that is rooted in place and in community, is hugely important for being able to sustain democracy. We teach at Citizen University that our way of talking about citizenship is that power plus character equals citizenship. If you want to live like a citizen, and again, I mean in the broadest ethical sense of being a member of the body, not passport holding, documentation status, United States citizen necessarily. You need both to be fluent in power and to understand money power, people power, ideas power, social norms power, the power of government, the power of force and violence, and understand how people all around us are practicing power in these different ways with these different tools. But then you need to couple that fluency in power with a grounding in civic character, with the values and the kind of prior commitment to, I'm going to do this not just for me. I'm going to do this so that we can actually thrive on the idea not of just charity or altruism, that I'm being a nice guy, but actually on the idea that we're all better off and we're all better off. Like, we need to actually include people in this process so that things don't tip over and we don't have revolution or breakdown, right? So first of all, that, but to the first part of your question about other nations or precedents for societies where democracy decays and they get to the brink, and are there cases where they've then been able to kind of either get away from the brink or get out of the chasm and fortify democracy? There are two categories of examples, actually. One, which I don't wish upon us, is societies that are where the slate is wiped completely clean, usually by war and devastation, right? And Germany and Japan post World War II are examples of that, right? The failure of the Weimar Republic in Germany that led to the fascist takeover by the Nazis and brought the world on fire in World War II, forced a reset in the world, but it certainly wiped the slate clean in Germany, where the Allies and the United States in particular, in West Germany, could create the framework for a liberal democracy. So that's one example of catastrophe wipes the slate clean. We don't want that. We don't wish that. Your question is really going toward kind of in more organic, non-catastrophic ways. And here I would point to an example that most people should know more about: the United States. The United States has at various points completely betrayed, in fact, for much of its history, has completely betrayed democracy, has completely undermined the Constitution and broken the creedal promises of the Declaration of Independence. Certainly, as long as there was slavery, that was true. But even post-Civil War, the years of Jim Crow, much of the United States either had or tolerated the actual subversion of the rule of law and the actual subversion of the 14th Amendment and equal protection of the laws. And we were a completely corroded, hypocritical, broken democracy. And it got worse at various times. In World War I, people don't know this enough. People should read a book by the historian Adam Hochschild, I think called American Midnight, about the way that the First World War empowered the Democratic president of that time, Woodrow Wilson, to suspend habeas corpus, to break unions and to kind of strangle freedom of the press and to violate the Constitution in any number of ways. The Second World War enabled that to happen in the context of the internment and incarceration of Japanese Americans, right? There have been various points where we have completely undermined democracy as a society. and then reckoned with that, and then um, you know, a critical mass of people organized over time, patiently, sometimes over decades, in the case of post-Reconstruction to the Civil Rights Movement, the 3 generations worth of joining clubs and persisting in the face of a complete superstructure that's aligned against you. And people kept on working to actually push the country to actually live up to its promise and its ideals. I think American history, properly understood, is a story of a beautiful, I would say, even exceptional creed, and then a long-running record of undermining and betrayal of that creed,
Hmm.
punctuated
Hmm.
by great mass bottom-up movements to force the country into greater alignment with its
Yeah.
ideals. And no victory is forever. We are in the politics we are right now because we are literally past living memory of people who learned the lessons of World War II and created NATO and created a culture of collective action and collective fate. Um, Everybody who remembered that has faded from the scene now,
Yeah.
and we're spoiled. We're getting on several generations past the civil rights movement, and certainly
Mhm.
living memory of what preceded the civil rights movement. Um, and and so that same sense of, oh well, any talk about the travails and struggles of black people and other people of color, that's just reverse racism. That is one of the most ahistorical things to
Yeah.
say. But we're in an ahistorical time because
Yeah.
time has passed, and so the United States itself, if we look at our full history properly, um, to me actually gives me hope, because it tells
We've
us
done it
that
before. Yeah.
we've done it before. We've made democracy healthier from a worse starting point than we have right now.
Amen. And I think even seeing what's happened recently in South Korea, like there's stuff where people are like, no, we're not gonna do
Yeah,
dictatorship here. Like
yeah.
that's not happening.
And look, South Korea is actually
Yeah.
a very interesting example
Yeah.
because even though that is a country to an extent that, like Japan and Germany, where the slate got wiped somewhat clean, after war, um, actually both Japan and South Korea remind us that culture does precede structure. Their forms of democracy are still exceedingly Japanese and South Korean, and Korean. They are exceedingly about concentrated power at the top. Their economy is very dominated by a few big entities that are interlocking. They have very little kind of habit of actual everyday self-organizing and everyday decision making by everyday people. And so they get kind of long periods of, hoarding and concentration in their
Mhm.
democracy, and then paroxysms of bottom up kind of
Yeah.
correction, right?
Yeah.
And that's what South Korea is at. That's what, and the United States used to have a culture of lots and lots of bottom up participation, that any would be dictator could never stamp out because it'd be like playing whack a mole. But we have been losing that in our lifetimes. We are more vulnerable to strongmen and to would be
Hmm.
authoritarians, precisely because we have forgotten how to organize laterally, and join laterally.
Yeah. So I've got a few more questions, and I know that we're close to running out of time, but I was wondering if you could say more about character. That's in your book, in many of your books, but you talk a lot about kind of what it means to kind of be wedded in a horizontal, laterally way. Like what does character mean, and how do average Americans who have never had any kind of character development, maybe a dismemory in a church, but like what does character mean in the context of an American citizenship?
Well, I'm glad you added that last phrase because when we talk about civic character in our work at Citizen University, we're actually not talking about character in the way that it often gets discussed in the United States, which is a very individualistic, personal kind of character, right? A lot of the conversation and debate about, for instance, character education in the schools is about teaching kids as individuals to work harder, to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, to be honest, to be diligent, All that is great. I'm totally for grit and diligence and perseverance and honesty. But what we're talking about actually is character in the collective, which are the values and habits of how to live together, um, how to how to sustain a community of unlike people, and those are a different set of virtues and values, virtues of um, curiosity, uh, reciprocity. You know, you don't have to overthink this. Like, you know, it's true that institutions have stopped doing this, but this is also as basic as the golden rule. And curiosity is as basic as, you know, don't judge till you think you understand, and don't think you understand until you've actually asked. These are habits that form a way of living among others, habits of service, values and virtues of contribution before consumption. Like, not what can I take and what can I get out of this, but what could I give to this?
Mm.
And also, you know, ultimately, civic character comes down to the sense of, I'm going to hold up my corner. I'm going to do my piece. None of us alone is actually enough. No one alone, no president or would-be strongman can actually, they can tell you that they alone can fix stuff, but they can't. And no, you know, and I think civic character is really about remembering that if we all actually do a bit more, things will actually, the social fabric will get more tightly knitted. Um, so, you know, that's what I would say broadly about civic character. And I think, you know, in some ways, it's an old fashioned set of ideas that seems associated with old fashioned institutions that younger people today, even people as young as you, you're younger than me, don't have exposure to anymore. That's fine. You don't have to go to an Elks Club to practice civic character. Although I actually would say if you're under 60, there's so much civic infrastructure sitting there, fallow, empty, waiting to be reanimated. Like, it would actually be great, Brandon, if you and a group of people your age peers decided, let's go actually revive elks. Let's go join the Rotary Club. Like, let's, you know, they've got
Yeah.
buildings, they've got spaces, they've got rituals. Like, they would be dying to have a group of 30 and 40 and 20 somethings come in their
Hmm.
door,
Hmm.
and just remember how to do stuff face to face, right? But that form of civic character, I know I said a lot of nouns, reciprocity and service and all that. Like, these are things that you do. If we think about them as verbs, um, done in practice in groups, that's what that's what we have the opportunity to return to.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I 100% agree. I mean, I've dove headfirst into my local Unitarian Universalist community. It is amazing, and I'm like, where are all the people my age? This is the
Yeah,
best. I wish I had like
yeah. Start
70 other
bringing some
people.
more. Start
Yeah,
inviting two friends and have them invite two friends. I mean, the classic
yeah,
thing. You know, the other thing I'll
exactly.
say about civic character, by the way, is actually it's true of what I'm talking about in general in this work. This is not, none of what I'm saying is a Republican or Democratic Party idea. It's not a left or right proposition. There are ways in which you can find, you know, aspects of what you might think of as principled conservatism, in what I'm describing about civic character, about community and family and obligation and duty and responsibility. And there's also aspects of what you can think of as progressive social justice orientations in the same thing. That it's not every man for himself. It's not just about you. It's about how we show up to make a more inclusive and equitable society, community together. And that is the beauty of what we get to do right now. The promise of American life is in the fusion of these ways of seeing. And you know, wherever you're coming from, left, right, or orthogonal to a left, right axis, there's a way in for this equation of power plus character.
I can't wait because we're gonna do this in May together. The power and character training for the homecoming. I'm excited for that. Or prior to the
Yes.
homecoming. Um, the last final question is like, what was the moment in time, or the place that most connects you to what it means to be an American citizen?
Hmm. Well, I, probably uh, the answer is an experience I had when I was a speechwriter for President Clinton. During those years, part of the highlight both of my time working at the White House, but to your question, one of the signal moments of Americanness for me was um, writing the speech that the president gave at the for the 50th anniversary of D-Day to commemorate the Allied invasion of Normandy and the liberation of Europe. Um, and and this was a speech that he gave at the American Military Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer on Omaha Beach in Normandy. And uh, to have to be a Gen X at the time, 20 something speechwriter, child of immigrants, working on this speech, writing the speech, which, that day was preceded by months and months with my colleagues and teammates working on the whole body of speeches that the president gave during that week of commemoration, which meant meeting veterans of the war, talking to people who had lived through that, reading tons of histories, reading letters from that era, getting steeped in that time. And so when that day arrived on June 6th, the morning of June 6th, 1994, to be a Gen X son of immigrant speechwriter as the country's first baby boom president was giving the speech to honor the GI generation um, uh, for what they had done to save the world was uh, was one of the most meaningful moments of my life. And I hesitated in saying this because that sounds very, that's a. So I guess I would couple that with a different story. That one is no question a peak life experience.
I can
Um,
imagine.
I'll never forget. There's a line in that speech where President Clinton said, he was pointing to the rows of D-Day veterans who were sitting in the front rows there. They were all in their 70s at the time. They all had put on and found, uniforms or found their medals and their hats and so forth, and tough as they could be of that, like they were of that generation. And when President Clinton said this line, he said, "Their ranks may be growing thinner, and they may walk with a little less spring in their step. But let us never forget, when they were young, these men saved the world." And when
Hmm.
he said that line, I looked over at those 2, 3 rows of
Hmm.
veterans sitting there, and they were all just kind of quivering and shaking, and they couldn't stop. They just started crying. And then I just turned to my fellow speechwriter,
Wow.
and we just started bawling. And how the presidents kept it together, I don't know, but like that I'll never forget. That was this deep thing of like, you know, a couple of decades earlier, my parents came to the United States, and that was possible was kind of remarkable. But the secondary story, I would just say, it's not even a story. The secondary thing I would say in answer to your question is not anything so kind of remarkable or rare, but it's actually people often assume because I worked in the White House and had a career in Washington D.C. that that's where I really learned about democracy and citizenship and power and everything that I want to teach at Citizen University. And that's partly true, but actually, the greater part of my education as a citizen has come in my 25 years as a citizen, as a member of the community here in Seattle and in Washington State. And it's by joining the library board. It's by being a captain of the Seattle Public School levy. It's by serving on the State Board of Education. It's by organizing co-founding an organization to address gun violence, the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, and just being a neighbor and being involved. You mentioned my wife, Janae Kane, who's the co-founder of Citizen University. My late wife, she died in 2023, but she did this. She never worked in D.C. She never walked the halls of power like that. But she was basically the mayor of our block in our neighborhood, and she was the one who organized everything, parties and snow shoveling for the elder neighbors, and and just checked in on people. And that way of living and being is actually at least as formative for me, actually more formative for me in what it means to be an American, what it means to live like a citizen, as my time in DC.
Love it. Happens at all levels. I love asking this question. Like my favorite.
Yeah, it's a great question.
All right. Well, Eric, thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you in May. And for those of you who want to learn more about Eric, you can check out Citizen University and also read his books, especially Become America. Especially in this moment as we enter the second Trump administration. It's really powerful. And then also Habits of Heart and Mind. You can get this for free. I'll post a link for where to get that. So thank you so much, Eric. I so appreciate your time. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon. Thanks for all you're doing and the ways that you're inviting people in to this conversation.
Got it. Take care.